In today's session, we will look at the poem, which is a sonnet, Death Be Not Proud by Donne. Introduction. Holy Sonnet 10, often referred to as Death Be Not Proud, was written by the English poet and Christian cleric John Donne in 1609 and first published in 1633. The poem is a direct address to death, arguing that it is powerless because it acts merely as a short sleep between earthly living and the eternal afterlife. In essence, death is nothing to fear. The sonnet, written mostly in iambic pentameter, is known as Donne's Holy Sonnets or Divine Meditations or Divine Sonnets. In keeping with these other poems, Holy Sonnet 10 is a devotional lyric that looks at life's biggest questions in the context of Donne's religious beliefs. Summary. The speaker directly addresses and personifies death, telling it not to be arrogant just because some people find death scary and intimidating. In fact, death is neither of these things. Because people don't really die when death, whom the speaker pities, comes to them, nor will the speaker truly die when death arrives for him. Comparing death to rest and sleep, which are like images of death, the speaker anticipates death to be even more pleasurable than these activities. Furthermore, it is often the best people who go with death, which represents nothing more than the resting of the body and the arrival of the soul in the afterlife. Death is fully controlled by fate and luck, and often administered by rulers acting desperate or people acting desperately. The speaker points out that death is also associated with poison, war, and illness. Drugs and magic spells are far more effective than death when it comes to rest. With all this in mind, what possible reason could death have for being so puffed up with pride? Death is nothing but a mere sleep in between people's earthly lives and the eternal afterlife, in which death can visit them no more. It is instead death, or a certain idea of death as something to be scared of, that is going to die. Now, the line by line explanation and analysis of Death Be Not Proud. Lines 1 to 4. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. As with many of Donne's poems, Death Be Not Proud starts boldly. While a sonnet might often be used to address a lover, here death itself is personified and instantly introduced as the recipient of the poem. The reader is essentially eavesdropping on the speaker's address to death. The word itself is capitalized, death, which makes the personification obvious by turning the word into a proper noun. The poem also begins with apostrophe, which makes it clear that death is the intended listener. By personifying death, the speaker imbues it with the undesirable human characteristic of misplaced pride. Death has a self inflated sense of importance and trades on its reputation as fearsome and final. The speaker acknowledges that some people view death in this way, but makes it clear that they shouldn't, and that the rest of the poem will prove why. Lines 2 to 4 expand on the opening proposition that death is wrong to feel proud, and that it is neither mighty nor dreadful. Death thinks that it can overthrow life, which, as the fourth line clarifies, means kill people. Here, death is characterized as an aggressor, but the speaker states very clearly that this aggression is misplaced because essentially nobody ever actually dies. This is, of course, a paradoxical statement. The poem doesn't really intend to deny the existence of death. Instead, it takes the Christian belief in the eternal afterlife as proof that death is really nothing at all. Though the afterlife has not yet been mentioned, it informs the atmosphere of the quatrain's proposition. Quatrain means a stanza of 4 lines. We are talking about the first 4 lines of the poem. Again, this sets up the standpoint of the poem's argument, and it is from here that the speaker must prove why this argument holds true. In line 3, the alliterative use of th sounds creates a delicate quality that juxtaposes, meaning brings two opposing ideas together, with the idea of death as a powerful almighty figure. The enjambment from lines 3 to 4. Enjambment means when the phrase or the idea is continued from one line into the other, suspends the sentence. The reader and death, as the poem's addressee, need to get to line 4 to understand what happens to those that supposedly die. The overthrow is literally thrown into a short suspense and then completely undercut by die not. The very reason then for death's existence is based on an untruth. Accordingly, the speaker again addresses death directly using apostrophe, but this time adding the adjective poor. Not only does the speaker not fear death, he actively pities it. For the most part, the poet conforms to the Petrarchan sonnet rhyme scheme, with an important difference to come. Here, the rhyme scheme sets up thee from line 1 in opposition with me in line 4. This puts death on one side of the argument, the wrong one, and the speaker on the other. By the end of line 4, the poem is still in the proposition stage of the argument. The bold statement has been made that death cannot kill, and it is up to the rest of the poem to somehow demonstrate this to be true. Lines 5 to 6. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure. In the poem's second quatrain, the speaker's argument enters its second stage. While the first quatrain established the poem's main points of contention, that death shouldn't be proud because it isn't mighty or dreadful, the next few lines deal specifically with the evidence that supports these claims. The speaker compares death, rest and sleep to death, suggesting that the former are images of the latter. This is part of the overall project to diminish death's power. Rest and sleep are, first and foremost, entirely harmless activities. In fact, they are the absence of activity, and in sleep's case, the switching off of conscious living. Furthermore, both rest and sleep have great benefits and are essential to life. They are at once daily harmless activities and important ways for people to maintain and restore good health. They are the necessary moments of inactivity that make activity possible. Accordingly, the speaker equates them with pleasure. Rest and sleep make people feel good. If death is just a heightened version of rest and sleep, then there is nothing to fear from it. The caesura in line 6 after pleasure allows the reader a literal rest. Caesura means in simple terms it means a pause. So it allows the reader a literal rest to consider the importance of rest and sleep. Likewise, the long vowel sounds in pleasure go as far as to create a sense of luxuriance deliberately at odds with the seemingly urgent topic of the poem. In this sense, then, the speaker is temporarily holding death at bay and exerting his own control. Lines 6 to 8. Then from thee much more must flow, and soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and soul's delivery. Having linked death with rest and sleep in the previous sentence, the speaker proceeds to the next stage in the logic of the poem's argument. If rest and sleep bring people pleasure, then death must be even more pleasurable, giving a kind of heightened and intensified version of them. Briefly, then, the speaker is actively praising death for bringing the big sleep to people. Line 6 uses alliterative M sounds to reinforce the idea that death is basically sleep plus, creating a sonic sense of bounty and abundance. Lines 7 and 8 then suggest that it is the best people on earth who often die earliest, perhaps hinting that they have been chosen by God for their reward of heavenly eternal life. Line 8 modifies the idea of death as rest by clarifying that the speaker only intends the comparison to apply to the physical body. The bones of the best men are their physical selves, their corporality, and it is only these that are laid to rest in death. Bones is therefore a syndosh for the human body. In a more literal sense, though, bones are indeed all that remains after a body goes through the processes of decay that come with death. For the speaker, bones are the inanimate leftovers of life on earth. But life on earth is not what is important to this poem. It is the soul's delivery, the arrival in the afterlife, that underpins the poem's entire argument. Death is really a form of transition from temporary life to eternal life. The poem plays on this with the word delivery, hinting at a kind of birth rather than death. Lines 9-10. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings and desperate men, and dost with poison, war and sickness dwell. Lines 9 and 10 begin the third quatrain, meaning the third stanza of 4 lines, and serve to further demonstrate death's weakness, and to divest it means take away from it its fearsome and intimidating quality. Intimidating means frightening quality. Essentially, they function as a kind of character assassination. first showing that death is not a master but a slave, and then that death is associated with some of the worst elements of the world. Though death is often thought of as something powerful, line 9 argues that it is actually weak, dominated by other elements or people. Firstly, death is slave to fate and chance, the assonance of the A vowels bolstering this connection. In essence, death is weaker than fate and chance and depends on them to do its work. Death is so weak, in fact, that it is also beholden to kings and desperate men. Both of these are, of course, human beings who are precisely the target of death's work. Kings, acting in positions of power, create conflict and have authority over their subjects. They therefore administer death themselves, implying that death, the personified version, is just as much a subject as anybody else. On this note, it is worth remembering that Donne was writing at a time when monarchies were extremely powerful. Monarchy means the rule of one person, in other words, kingship, and had a huge role in shaping world history. Now, many of them are largely symbolic and ceremonial. The desperate men can be read as referring to people who commit murder or to those who take their own lives out of desperation. Both readings are possible. In line 9 continues this line of argument, accusing death of being a bedfellow of poison, war, and sickness. The speaker presents these as ugly and undesirable things to be associated with. Essentially, death has nothing better to do than hang out with the worst elements of human life. Lines 11-12. And happy, poppy or charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. Why swellest thou then? Lines 11 and 12 return to the speaker's comparison of death with sleep. Once again, the argument seeks to deny death any authority. Both these lines use anaphora to continue the line of argument, beginning in the same way as in lines 10 and 7 with and. This creates the sense of an accumulation of reasons as to why death is so powerless, also almost suggesting that the speaker could name more of it if it weren't for the confines of the sonnet form. Though the speaker has admitted the benefit of death if it is framed merely as a kind of sleep, even on those terms it is inferior. Poppy, which is a reference to a kind of opiate drug that were popular at the time, is presented as a more effective method for sleep than death. Charms refers to magic spells and incantations, जिसको हम हिंदी में जादू टोना समझते हैं, both of which the speaker considers superior to death in terms of bringing about sleep. The speaker frames this superiority in first 5 words of line 12, and better than thy stroke. The stroke functions in two slightly paradoxical ways. First of all, it acknowledges the idea of death as a powerful figure. Death is often personified as being able to administer death to the living without any difficulty, in the figure of the Grim Reaper, for example. But a stroke is also a gentle motion and even an act of affection. As in line 4, then, death is presented as meek and mild. The caesura in line 12 indicates that the poem is reaching the end of its argument, and sets up the speaker's final challenge to death. In light of all the evidence that has been presented, how can death still swell up with pride? This ties in with the first line too, which instructed death to not be proud. Lines 13-14. One short sleep past we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Lines 13 and 14 bring the poem to its conclusion, making explicit, meaning clear, the reason why the speaker has been so bold in addressing death, the eternal afterlife. Death is nothing but a short sleep, a transition from earthly living, with all its miseries and pains, to eternity. The monosyllabic words that begin in line 13 emphasize this idea of shortness. The whole poem depends upon faith and is informed by Christian theology. When people wake eternally, they will be out of death's reach. Death as a concept will be as good as dead to them. Here it seems likely that the poem is informed by the Bible, namely Book 1 of Corinthians, chapter 15, verse 26. The final enemy to be destroyed is death. It is interesting to note that these lines present a more uplifting and affirmative tone than many of the others in the Holy Sonnet series, which generally consist of a speaker trying to reconcile belief in God with their place in the world, in the hope of attaining eternal life in heaven. With that in mind, there is an important distinction to be made about the poem. In its last line, the speaker does not literally mean that death has been defeated. Death remains a constant presence in the world. But death, viewed in the bright light of faith, is nothing to be feared. And it need not have any of the characteristics that are usually attached to it. In a sense, then, the poem is an argument not just against death, but also for faith. Now we look at the vocabulary in the poem Death Be Not Proud and their meanings. Thee means you, thou also means you, art is are, thinkest means think, dost, second person singular present form of do. The usage here in line 2, for instance, simply emphasizes that death thinks he really does overthrow, that is, kill people, an assumption the speaker counters in the following line. Canst, the second person singular present form of can. Thy, the old form of your. Pictures. Pictures here simply means images with possible connotations of paintings or artworks. Essentially, a dead person looks like someone resting or asleep. Bones. Bones refers to the bones left behind after someone dies and to the body more generally. Poppy. Poppy is a reference to drugs, particularly those of the opioid family, which are derived from the poppy plant. Opium was a popular drug in the 17th century and induces a sleepy, dreamlike state. यहाँ आपको बता दें कि ओपियम को हिंदी में अफीम कहते हैं, जिससे नशा होता है और इंसान को नींद भी आती है. Charms. Charms is a reference to magic spells. जादू टोना वाला. Stroke. Stroke means touch, referring to the moment when death comes to someone. Swellist. Swellist is an abbreviation of swellist, which is an archaic version of swell up.